So let's start talking about what was in our book. So, why do cultures vary? What leads to cultural variation? These are difficult questions, and the answers require considering the diversity of forces that impact what we are and what we do. One such force is our physical environment and what our surroundings require of us to survive. For example, the types of food available, such as big or small prey or vegetation, within a given ecology affect foraging and hunting behaviors, and directly what we eat. Indirectly, our environments can impact what we value, such as variation in gender roles. In our book, Hein explains how a harsher environment can lead to an increased culture of quote unquote masculinity. For example, on the South Pacific island of Truk, men go on dangerous deep sea fishing expeditions. The Trukis value masculinity, manifested in men engaging in violent clashes with knives and clubs. In contrast, in Tahiti, where the environment is pretty benign, with lots of food easily acceptable, men and women don't need to go on dangerous hunts, as such violent shows are not valued, and as a result, there's little or no warfare or feuding. As our physical environments change either over time or what seems to be pretty rapidly, it will be interesting to see how cultural values change. An example is the behaviors and values and actual laws that are regarded toward water conservation in places like California. Here, lush lawns were viewed with disdain, while brown and dry became a look to be proud of. And it showed you are part of this cultural norm or a cultural effort. So, what are theories that account for the cultural variations we're seeing? Local ecologies' impacts are exerted in different ways. As brought up in our book, Jared Diamond's 1997 book, Guns, Germs, and Steel, they explore how the Spanish were able to overcome the Incan Empire in a very lopsided battle. Proximal causes are those that have direct and immediate effects. For example, in the book, the conquistadors kept a written history from which they learned. They also had guns and steel swords and armor, ships, horses, and other things that allowed them to quickly overcome the Incans, who lacked such technology. In addition to the Incans not having these tools and weapons, they were also dealing with an epidemic of smallpox that was introduced by the first Spanish explorers. It's a lot. In concert, distal causes are initial differences that lead to effects over long periods of time. So why did the Spanish have these proximal advantages over the Incans? With regard to distal causes, Diamond proposed that geographical differences were involved. The Spaniards were from a large area known as the Fertile Crescent, where there was an abundance of easy-to-domesticate plants and animals spread across Eurasia, allowing for development of agriculture. This provided sufficient food for people, which could then give up their nomadic lifestyles and live in place. They could devote time to activities other than gathering and hunting, such as creating tools and learning to work with steel, and exchanging ideas and innovations. The Americas had no such endowments. So think about how disease or war can have proximal and distal impacts. Smallpox had proximal impacts where the Spanish introduced smallpox to the Incas, and decimated their population. Distally, Spanish lived near animals and evolved immunity, given to the Incans who were not immune. Our book also discusses how even the way we think can be influenced by geographic variations. Hein demonstrates this by focusing on two key crops grown and harvested in China, rice and wheat. Rice involved growing rice in paddies of standing water. The farmers, or the rice farmers, need to work very hard, have sufficient water collected and channeled through irrigation channels to the rice paddies. and this requires cooperation with other rice farmers. In terms of wheat, and in contrast, wheat farming is less intensive. Wheat is grown in fields that needs little irrigation. This requires less labor and less need for cooperation with other farmers. So in a study in 2014 with Chinese university students from wheat and rice growing counties, even though the students might not have been involved in the actual farming themselves, there were differences in their thinking. Students from rice-growing regions revealed greater interdependent thinking, seeing themselves as part of a network, tolerant to practices that favored friends and family members, and engaged in more holistic reasoning, as opposed to those that came from wheat farmers who didn't show this network or interdependent thinking. While proximal and distal arguments suggest how a geography can lead to differences in cultural responses, there are other propositions of how geography can induce cultural variation. One proposition, evoked culture, proposes that certain environmental conditions evoke certain responses from people. Such responses come to comprise culture. For example, as the book describes, across the world, we afford a lot of emphasis on attractiveness when looking for a mate. But what do we find attractive? In terms of evolution, attractive individuals are those who are less likely to be suffering from parasitic infections and so have symmetry and smoothness to their appearance. But what about other characteristics such as intelligence, humor, and kindness? These characteristics will come into play mostly in geographic areas where illness is less of a threat. But in areas where parasitic illness is a threat, other characteristics are less the defining aspect. Another proposition is apropos with Hines' definition of culture, transmitted culture, proposing that cultural ideas that are learned via social transmission or modeling can spread across locations, ecologies, and environments. Unlike evoked culture, transmitted culture can travel with people when they visit or move to new environments, or even interchange with people from other cultural groups. All right. To show that there is more to cultural variation than just variations in environment from evoked culture, Hines introduces the example of two cultural groups, the Dinka and the Nuer, who coexist in the marshlands of South Sudan. Despite the fact that both cultures share similar ecology, technology, crops, and livestock, and the same ancestry, they have very different cultural expressions. In terms of livestock and diet, the Dinka slaughter their livestock and rely on meat, while the Nuer maintain larger herds and rely on milk. In terms of tribal membership and kinship, the Dinka focus on proximity and integrate with who lives next to whom during the wet season, while the Nuer focus on male line of patriarchy. The Dinka bring smaller and less aggressive or less organized are less organized toward defense, while the Nuer are larger, organized, and created a military power. So we see how the same geography can result in different cultural practices, possibly both evoked and transmitted. In this case, and in other studies described in the book, it seems that tribal affiliation trumps ecological pressures in predicting the attitudes and behaviors of a community. As such, transmitted culture can play a more powerful role in cultural variation than evoked external pressures. So now we're going to stop, but I'd like you to look at this video called Unpredictable Environment, and then we'll come back.